Welcome back to Holy Shift. As we wrap up this season, we wanted to take a moment to look back at some of the incredible science we've explored together. From breakthrough ideas to the personal stories behind them, it's been such a powerful reminder of just how much discovery is happening and how much it matters. So in this episode, we're bringing you a few of our favorite moments, some of the best science, insights, and conversations from this season, all in one place. As we start thinking about what's next for season 2 of Holy Shift, we'd love to hear from you. We've put together a short listener survey to learn more about your experience with the podcast, what you've loved, what you want more of, and what we can do better in the next season. It only takes a few minutes, and your feedback will really help shape where Holy Shift goes from here. In fact, one lucky survey respondent will be chosen to receive a Holy Shift listener swag package. You can find the survey link in the show notes. All right, let's jump into some of the standout moments from this season. Tell us about your research, kind of how you would tell someone maybe in an elevator what you do for your research.
Yeah, so I am a computational researcher, and I simulate the way that cells behave. So that can mean how cells respond to drugs. It can be how cells organize into tissue structures. And I'm also involved with trying to understand how cells can be used as therapeutics for kind of this next generation of therapeutic design. So all of that requires computational modeling, and we use engineering principles to understand and predict the way that cells behave.
My lab is called the Neuromechanics Lab, and basically it's about how our nervous system, our brain, spinal cord, and nerves, and our bodies, the mechanical parts, bones and muscles, work together to create movement.
Okay, so when we think about movement, dig in a little bit more of that. Like, what kind of movement do you research in your lab?
I mostly study balance control and walking. Those are really fundamental behaviors that everybody needs to get around in life. And I like to think about it as maybe the nervous system is like the software and your body is the hardware. And instead of studying just one or the other, I want to know how they interact to create all of the different things we can do, not just walking and balance.
I work on microsystems, and so microsystems are it's a very broad field, but very interesting things happen at the microscale that we can take advantage of.
From a 10,000-foot level, I'd say my research has to do with fixing hearts.
Nice.
So we can start there. We go from adult hearts, so patients who've had heart attacks, the muscle dies, and it doesn't rebuild itself like regular muscle. And so we try to make materials, make cells that rebuild that muscle and try to regain their function. But then also about 10 years ago, we realized that kids also have these problems too. And it's a little bit different from adults. They don't have heart attacks. They're born with defects, that just happen. And the best we can do for some of them is just try to plug it in and see what we can do. And we use stem cells and other materials to see if we can rebuild or rejuvenate their hearts.
Yeah, I would say our work, we're trying to develop through the use of 3D printing, which I think most people are familiar with now.
Yes.
Medical devices, especially for kids, for pediatrics, where you might have sort of one-off needs for a medical device. And I think 3D printing really gave us the capability to do that on a really customized basis. So our whole, I think, goal or focus of our research is to have the capability, if a clinician comes to us and say, hey, I have this case, could we develop a device for this kid? And that's sort of the way I got started in doing this, actually.
Well, I study how the nervous system controls the lower urinary tract, which is to say, how the neurons in your body help the bladder relax at the right time and contract at the right time, and the urethra to relax at the right time, so that you can get your peeing done.
Can you talk about, what made you decide to become passionate about this? Why did you decide to become a biomedical engineer and drive this type of research? And do you have any stories that you can speak of where it's really impacted your life?
Well, growing up, my grandfather was a doctor, and we had lots of little things around the house. I always had a chemistry set and things like that, and it always interested me in science. And I think when I went to college, I really wanted to go to medical school. I was taking a pre-med, and I was going to take the MCATs, and I realized I spent a summer catching bees on a landfill.
Oh, I love it. I'm a beekeeper, so tell me
So
more.
I'm allergic to bees.
Oh, no!
And so I needed a job. I wanted to live on campus and take classes over the summer, and I wanted to get more involved in science. And I said, you can go work in environmental science. I was really interested in the environment.
Right.
And they said, well, you're going to catch bees on a landfill.
Oh, my gosh.
And I joke, I'm not
How
kidding.
do you catch bees?
I'm not kidding. The landfill was called Fresh Kills.
Oh, God.
Because apparently a kill is a waterway. And so in New York City, I'm from New York, New Jersey, I went to Rutgers. And so we would drive every day to the Arthur Kill, which is where this big landfill was. They would bring these barges of trash, and they would do that. And this environmental scientist wanted to see what kind of flowers he could plant, because eventually they want to close these landfills, right? Stop putting trash on it and regrow the forest. And he wanted to see how bees, if you have a small cluster of plants versus larger, how they do it. So I would get a net, and we would catch a bee, and you would fling the net around, and you would stick it in dry ice. And the bee would fall asleep from the carbon dioxide.
Right.
And then you had these little resin that they could put like a little tag on the bees. And it was harrowing because the smell was bad.
Oh, wow.
It was hot, and I was allergic to bees.
And you were how old?
19.
Okay. And you did this because this was paying for your college, or why did you do this insane thing again?
It was paying for me to stay on campus for the summer, and I decided sort of that summer that I loved research more than I loved the medical school part of it.
Okay.
And then I used that, and I got an internship at Johnson & Johnson the next year because they were so impressed by the bee story. They were like, wait, you caught bees all summer?
Right.
And tagged them and ran around a landfill catching bees? I said, I ran around a landfill catching bees. And they were like,
talk about passion.
He's going to do what it takes to get it done. He'll do anything, right? And so I studied like diabetic wound healing for Johnson & Johnson.
Oh, nice.
And then I really, I got my own project. I fell in love with research, and the rest is history.
When I was in grad school, so my dad has Parkinson's disease. And, he'd been diagnosed for a while. But when I was in grad school was around the time we started really noticing, his symptoms. Like, I remember my mom called me one day and said, hey, your dad's like stuck at the gas station. And I was like, oh, is like the car not working? And it was just, no, he couldn't drive anymore. His Parkinson's was getting to the point where, he just didn't have like good control of his body at times. And that really, started like affecting him, and of course affecting me when like one of the most influential people in your lives starts to have problems with their body. So you might be familiar with Parkinson's, but one of the treatments for Parkinson's is something called deep brain stimulation.
Yes.
And that's where they take an electrode, which is, a device that can emit current, and put it like deep into the brain, into a place that's known to be like really important for movement. And what we saw was, you could literally now, when you turn this device on and start stimulating with like a tiny bit of electrical current, you can just see like my dad's ability to move completely change, right? Like he has very little control of his movements, and all of a sudden, like that, he's able to move again. He's able to eat well and things like that. And so I had always thought like, biology, this like wet stuff, I don't understand it. Computers, I can do that. Physics, I can do that. But then I realized like there are things we can do with like the things that I know, like physics and electrical engineering, that can actually like really dramatically change people's lives. And so that, was a pretty big sign that like, oh, I can still kind of do interesting sci-fi stuff and maybe also help people at the same time.
Okay, when you were a little girl, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I wanted to go into technical theater, actually.
What is that?
So that's like sets and light design and things like that. So the first circuits I built were actually for lighting for the theater.
I think I wanted to be a truck driver.
Oh, I love it. Did you see someone that was a truck driver and
Yes.
think that is a really cool job?
I did. I knew one of my friends was, his dad was a truck driver, and he had this giant truck.
Okay.
And he went all over in this giant truck, and I thought it was amazing.
So I don't remember exactly when I was 5, but I have a very distinct memory of being in 3rd grade and taking a health class.
Okay.
And I remember the teacher, I remember the class, I can even still picture the book, the textbook we were using.
Wow, that's impressive.
And it really made an impact on me.
Yeah.
And I very much loved just learning about the wonders of the human body and like how it all functions and learning about disease. And so from 3rd grade, for many years after that, I said I was going to be a doctor.
I was obsessed with dinosaurs when I was
Oh,
5.
this is amazing. Okay.
Obsessed. Yeah. So.
And your favorite dinosaur was?
Oh, probably Triceratops.
Okay.
Love Triceratops. Or Stegosaurus. I don't know. I love them all.
Right.
But yes, I had memorized like every dinosaur. That was even before. This was like in the 70s. Like
Yes.
dinosaurs really weren't mainstream. Like,
This is before
oh,
Jurassic
yeah.
Park.
Yes. So I was really into dinosaurs. So at 5, no, I was not a computer nerd.
Growing up as a kid in India in the 80s and the 90s, your parents were very clear with you. They really gave you a couple of options. They said, kid, you can go do whatever you want, so long as you're either an engineer or a doctor. It was very, very simple.
Yeah.
It was very, very clearly laid out. Unfortunately, my sister, who was a vascular surgeon, is a smart one, who got the grade to make it to medical school. I wasn't that smart. And so I narrowly missed out on getting into medical school. But I was very fortunate that in the early 90s, biomedical engineering had started to arrive, on the scene, and there were a few biomedical engineering undergraduate programs in India. And so I was very lucky to actually be one of the very, very early enrollees in biomedical engineering in the early 90s in India.
Somebody asked me, like, when did you know you wanted to become a biomedical engineer? I'm like, I've never tried to become a biomedical engineer.
Yesterday?
Right? I've tried to do a lot of other stuff, but it turns out, like, biomedical engineering is exactly the right place for what I want to do. So kind of discovered that along the way.
How do you navigate that and find the funding and the partner so that you can drive success?
Well, first of all, I should say thank you, because your tax money and my tax money is what funds a lot of our research. And I think knowing that gives us a perspective. My lab is constantly asking, are we working on the most important question we can address? What is the thing that we can do right now that is most important to, our goal of understanding the brain? Because we don't want to waste our money.
Right.
Or your money.
Yeah, I love this, yeah.
And we rely on the federal government for funding because the work that I do is more basic science. So when I think about research, sometimes I think of it as a journey, right? And there are different types of journeys you can take. Sometimes you can see where you want to go. And, it's like looking at the top of a mountain. You know it's there. You know you can get there. You just don't know how yet. And I think that kind of research maybe has a little bit more chance of getting funded by some of the drug companies, especially if you can see the peak from not too far away, right?
Yes,
it doesn't take too much to get there. Or some of the other medical companies. But the kind of research that my lab works on is more like this exploratory research where we suddenly stumbled upon a whole new continent. And now we have to see what's there and what might be useful about it.
What if in this day and age, we just decided we weren't going to fund this type of research? What do you think the impact on the community would be if that were the case?
Honestly, I think it would be a major shift in how we see healthcare today. I think in the US, we're very fortunate. I think we know that we have access to some of the best technologies in healthcare and medicine, but there is also a sense of hope. I think the technology may not be there yet, but there is a sense of hope that there are things that are being tested, right? That there are things that will be available to you or your children. And the type of work that I do, these are, again, things that maybe will be the next generation of technologies, right? So I think if we lose this kind of investment, we will lose some of that hope. And I think that we need to protect that.
If they only remember one thing about the work that you do, why it's important and why it should be supported, what would you want that to be?
I would want them to know that I'm very grateful for the opportunity to do this type of work. It does involve a lot of sacrifice. It's a lot of long hours. But I know deep down that I can do this work because of taxpayers. And because of the support of, the Emory and Georgia Tech, and also the federal government. And that one of the things that's interesting is, sometimes academic research can feel really glacial. But for me, as a child born in the 80s, my life is dramatically different. I started out with a record player and then moved on to tapes and CDs and MP3 players, and I got to experience all of those along the way. And a lot of that's academic research that goes out into the world. So I guess what I would want the public to know is that I'm grateful for the resources that they share with the university, and I really am working hard to make sure that they get something out of it.
Let me ask, what do you think is one thing that an average person needs to know in order to advocate for research like yours?
Well, I think that most people, luckily can relate to the idea of visual impairment. Both of us wear glasses. I think many people wear corrective lenses around the world, or even if they don't, that feeling of getting up in the middle of the night in the dark to get something and putting out your hands, bumping to the wall. I think everyone can relate to this. And so I would say that, if anyone can relate to that feeling of what loss of vision is like, doing what they can to advocate for those who don't have, corrective lenses or a way to just turn on the light to get it back, and so whether or not that's volunteering with a community organization, whether or not that is advocating for biomedical research, whatever that may be, I think that, being able to, just share that with their friends and family, and kind of show people that this research really is kind of impactful for others' lives. I think this is probably the most important way that people can advocate for the work.
I say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so I think they need to understand that advocating for as early intervention as possible, like we know these diseases have poor long-term outcomes, but we're excited by the great short-term outcomes. I think they have to understand that just because it has like a good short-term outcome doesn't mean that the long-term outcome is beneficial. So we have to really get in there and do better, earlier on, so that way we can head off these long-term problems.
Before we go, just one more quick reminder. We'd love for you to take a few minutes to fill out our listener survey. Your feedback is a huge part of how we shape Holy Shift, from the topics we cover to the stories we tell and the voices we bring on the show. It truly helps us make the podcast better and more meaningful for you. As a thank you, we'll randomly select one survey respondent to receive a Holy Shift listener swag package. You can find the link in the show notes, and it only takes a few moments. Thank you so much for listening. We look forward to seeing you for season 2 in September. That's it for this episode of Holy Shift, Biomedical Breakthroughs Shaping Tomorrow. If today's conversation sparked your curiosity, pass it along to someone eager to explore the power of research to change lives. As a reminder, the opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and guest and do not represent those of any organization mentioned. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. To learn more about the research featured on this show, visit bme.gatech.edu or check the show notes for links and resources. Thanks for listening, and remember, behind every innovation is a purpose, a person, and a powerful story.